encouragement. You know, I would imagine many of you remember in school studying things like Greek mythology. Now, here's the thing about Greek mythology. It is mythology. It's a myth. It's make-believe. However, there are some interesting things when you read through all of those chronicles. That there's some things that are funny, that are entertaining for sure, that maybe will even make you think a little bit and ponder some things as you think about how that might apply in some way. One of my favorite stories is about King Sisyphus. Now, this was a bad guy. He was a villain. Again, this is a make-believe story in Greek mythology, but he was a bad guy, but he was crafty and smart and was able to outsmart death, or Hades, and was able to cause a little trouble for Zeus and all of that. Well, eventually it caught up with him, and so Hades, or death, came for him and got him. And his punishment for all of these terrible things was to roll a boulder up the hill, but only to see it roll back down at the bottom of the hill. That he would never be able to actually top the hill, that he would roll it and roll it and roll it, it would come back down, and then for eternity, he had to do this over and over again. I would imagine some of you probably look at that story and go, that's my life. I don't know, that's just a guess. Where it feels like we're just going over and over, going through the motions, but never getting anywhere. And if you think about it, that probably is where a lot of people are in their lives. And think about how discouraging it is when we feel like we're doing something that actually means nothing. If we feel like we're doing something over and over, trying to succeed, but there's no success, or at least in our mind there's no success, we will never win. We will never be able to do something that actually makes a difference in the world, like I'm rolling a boulder up the hill, only to see it come back down again and go over and over again. These kinds of things, this kind of story, opens our eyes to talk about and think about persistent discouragement. Persistent discouragement. You know, discouragement is an interesting thing, and if we were to define it through Webster's dictionary, I think they had a little fun with the definition of discouragement, actually. Here's what they basically said. They used all D words, which I think is funny: dispiritedness, downheartedness, dejection, depression, demoralization, disappointment, despondency, despair. My guess is they thought, you know what, no one's going to ever look up discouragement because everyone knows what it is. So we're going to use a bunch of other D words that you have to look those words up to figure out how in the world it fits with discouragement. I don't know, but I thought it was kind of weird. But the truth is we probably really don't need a dictionary to tell us what discouragement is. We know exactly what it feels like, what it tastes like. I mean, just everything. We know what discouragement is. Ultimately, discouragement is hopelessness. A lack of confidence, a lack of enthusiasm, maybe pessimism would fit into that a little bit, where you look at a thing and you go, it's never going to work. It's never going to happen. It's never going to go. Or just sort of this gloominess or gloomful type of situation where you just go, oh, it's just not going to be what I want it to be. Discouragement is discouraging. And of course, it's completely different than what we really want. What we want is encouragement, right? And so when you look at the difference between the two, they're of course markedly different, where encouragement would say, you have, you can, you will, but discouragement says, you haven't, and you can't, and you won't. Encouragement says, I believe in you. And discouragement says, I don't. You know what? I get discouraged at times. And I'm sure that's not a surprise to you, but I get discouraged at times. I get discouraged by all sorts of things. Like, for instance, I'm on my 478th day of not working out. I'm discouraged about that. I haven't really counted that, by the way. It's just an estimate, but something like that. You know, those kinds of things do discourage us when we think about where we are and we want to work out, or New Year's resolutions. What's that? I mean, here we are in March, that kind of stuff. And that kind of stuff is discouraging, but that's not really what I'm worried about. I get discouraged about things like anger. You know, when I was a young man before I was a Christian, I was angry all the time. All the time. And I acted out in that anger because when you're a heathen, I guess that's what you do. You get angry. You act out in that anger because you find after a time that you can kind of get your way when you lose your temper. And these days, if it creeps up, it discourages me. If I lose my temper or lose my cool with someone, it's discouraging. to my heart that I allowed myself to go there. When friendships fall apart, it's discouraging. But when friendships come alive, it's great. Like this past week, I had dinner with an old high school buddy that I hadn't heard from in over a decade. And when we did talk, it wasn't great in the past. We'd only seen each other a couple times since we had graduated from high school. And we were best of friends back then. But he was going to come to Little Rock, sent me a note on Facebook, and we got together. And it was so good for my heart. It was just so good to be with him. And by this, he's a Christian now, and he has a kid. And here we are, and we were able to share life together again and order exactly the same food and the exact same drink, because that's how we always were all those years ago. But so encouraging. But when friendships fall apart or they go nowhere, it's discouraging. When my wife Jennifer and I don't get along, it's discouraging. When I allow the devil to convince me that I am not who he says that I am, it's discouraging. Or when I allow other people to look at me and say, this is who you really are, that's discouraging. It hurts. Or when I hear those kinds of things and I begin to think, maybe I'm not the man Jesus has in mind. Maybe I'm not the man that I should be or even want to be. And those things feel disqualifying and discouraging when we don't capture them. When I continue to do what I don't want to do, it's discouraging. Paul talks about this. Paul talks about it in Romans 7, where he's like, why is it that I cannot seem to do the things that I want to do, and the things I want to do, I can't seem to do, and struggles with that. I don't know if you understand that. Like, I know what I need to do, I know what I want to do, but I continually fail. It's discouraging. Yes? It's so discouraging. And, as a pastor, I have discouragements too. And again, I don't suspect any of that stuff that I said that's discouraging to me is a surprise. And probably if I were to say, here's what's discouraging to me as a pastor, it probably won't surprise you either. Like, one of the things that really discourages me is inconsistency. But even within myself, it's not a finger-pointing thing. Isn't inconsistency discouraging? When you expect it to be one way and then it's not, that's discouraging. It's so frustrating. And those are the kinds of things when I expect like attendance or offering and those kinds of things to be in a certain place and it's not, it's discouraging. And I have to remember that Jesus is doing something in there, that Jesus is at work, and ultimately it's not my job to fix it. But I think the problem is, as a man, I want to fix everything. Anyone identify with that? You want to fix stuff? Any women want to identify with your man wanting to fix everything, whether you ask him to or not? Yes, those kinds of things. I want to fix it, but I get to a place where it's discouraging because I know I can't. I know I can't. It has to be God that fixes it in all of the inconsistencies. In my life, in yours, in ours together, it's all of that stuff. Or how about this? Comparison. That is a discouraging thing. When you begin to compare, well, but they do this, and what about this, and we this, them this, those kinds of things, or it can be so discouraging. And I will tell you, in ministry, one of the most discouraging things is when you get tired and you just don't have the energy to do another thing. I mean, truth be told, this was a long weekend around here. And then, for whatever reason, we planned it on daylight savings time. So we got one less hour. And I got up this morning and I thought, I'm not sure I can pull this off. In my flesh, I couldn't. I'm tired. But when you get tired because you're serving and tired because you're striving to do what God has called you to do, you usually get tired and worn and weary because you're not doing a good job of feeding your soul. And I think that ends up being discouraging and discourages us in all kinds of things. If you're not doing a good job of looking at what God has to say, and you're not allowing God to pour into you because he wants to, but you put a cap on and go, I'm not going to let you pour into me today. I'm going to do this my way. I want to solve it my way. I'm not going to let you pour in. When we get to that place, we grow empty fast. If we're not praying our way through the discouraging things, we get empty fast. And discouragement leads to discouragement, and it leads to discouragement. And we fall into a pattern sometimes where we're just living a life of discouragement. And I suspect you get there. I suspect you get discouraged as well. I suspect that because you're human. And it's easy to get discouraged about things that don't go the way that we have planned. And I assume that, like me, you get discouraged from external things that come at you, like nasty things that are said or done. You get discouraged by external, but you also get discouraged by internal things when that voice inside your head tells you you're a failure and it's not going to work. It's not going to go the way that you want it to go. And so we get discouraged over things like there's too much month left at the end of the paycheck. That's really discouraging. Or you always feel behind, like the to-do list never gets shorter, no matter how much you mark off. You could do what I do, though, by the way, and that is if you actually accomplish something that's not on your to-do list, you write it on that to-do list and mark it off. It makes you feel so much better. But thank you for that clap. But at the end of the day, it just makes the list longer. It doesn't actually accomplish anything. And if you start to tell yourself the truth, like, I really didn't get anything done that I intended to. I just put about 12 things on there that I wasn't planning to do that I did, and so it doesn't really help any. But we get discouraged about those kinds of things because you know as well as I do, almost everybody in here wishes you had a third arm and 4 more hours every day. But here's what I guarantee you. If you had 4 more hours in the day, you would spend it. And you would fill it up. Because that's what Americans do. No margins. We fill every waking moment and sometimes sleeping moment with something. And we end up being discouraged and overwhelmed. There's other things. Like, I know one of the challenges in the church community is that people get discouraged over giving. It's one of those, I know what I need to do, I know what I want to do, but I can't get there. Well, you can, of course, you have to understand what God has said and the promises that He has made, and it truly is easier than you think, and it is seeking Him first and allowing Him to take care of it, or testing Him and see, because He offers that to you, but still, you get into that weird place where I know what I want to do, but I don't feel like I can get there because I'm not sure that I trust, and I'm scared, and what does it do? It makes us discouraged. It just puts us in a place of discouragement. Or how about when your kids are disobedient? Discouraging. Or when you have an unfaithful or unbelieving spouse? Discouraging. Or when a spouse will not join you at church? It's discouraging. Or illness is discouraging. A difficult boss is discouraging. A lack of satisfaction with your home, with your car, with your career. It's discouraging. By the way, a lot of that is issues of contentment, but still, it's discouraging. Or a lack of deep relationships, discouraging, or hurtful words when they're said to you or about you. It's discouraging. Gossip, slander, backbiting, lies, drama. Drama is discouraging. Can I get an amen on that one? Or how about forgiveness? A lot of people just cannot forgive others. They don't feel forgiven themselves by God. And sometimes they can't forgive themselves. It happens a lot. Intellectually, I may think, well, God has forgiven me, but I'm not sure I can forgive me. By the way, Jesus' blood is enough. It's enough, no matter what it is you've done. But it's easy to get discouraged about those things. If you ask the secular world, in no Christian context, you ask the secular world what they think discouragement is or where does it come from, they're going to have pretty much, I think, the same kinds of answers. They may not be discouraged over giving and some of that kind of stuff, but if you ask them, because the research is out there, the secular world will tell you that comparison is discouraging. When you start to compare what you have with what someone else does, or chronic complaining is discouraging. When you do it and when you receive it. Discouraging. Or feeling unsupported by the people that you love. Or just life sometimes. Life is hard and discouraging at times when you don't feel like you measure up. Or you're sensitive to criticism and you cannot take criticism. It's discouraging. Or you dwell on a past mistake. It's discouraging. Or you have the victim mentality, or you're around people that have victim mentality. It's discouraging, isn't it? Or entitlement. That's discouraging. Discouragement is everywhere. But those things, those discouraging things, they may not all fit you. But I would imagine some of them do. When I look at that list, I think, as a man, as a dad, as a husband, as a pastor, I understand a lot of them. It depends on the day. It's not like we walk around in constant discouragement always in all those areas. Surely that cannot be the case. If it is for you, we got a lot of work to do, but still, we get discouraged easy. And so even though discouragement in a job or a relationship or a circumstance or just life in general is normal, and it's an unfortunate normal thing. And so although it's normal and terrible sometimes, discouragement in our walk of faith is far worse. Discouragement in our faith in God and what He calls us to can be devastating. But the great news is that the Bible has something really important to say about discouragement, and not just about discouragement, but how to overcome it. And so this is our theme for 2019, to overcome. Many of you have said, boy, I really like the series that we're in. This is actually not a series. This is who we are called to become, overcomers. It is what we're doing this year. It's what God has asked this church to do, is to work through the things that beat us down and destroy us, and to find a way to allow Him to overcome it, because that's what He wants to do. To overcome these things for you, to make you and me overcomers. And so, today I want to tell you the story of Nehemiah. It's one of my favorite stories about discouragement and healing from discouragement, and hopefully you will see it today. But Nehemiah, just to make sure you know who he is, this is in the Old Testament. Nehemiah was a person, he was a Jew who had been taken into Babylonian captivity, like many of the characters that we've talked about. This is very common of the Jews in ancient times, and it is one of the themes that runs throughout the Old Testament. But Nehemiah had a job, and he was the cupbearer of King Artaxerxes, Persian king. And so as the cupbearer, he was sort of like, if you think about it, the private bartender for the king. That's what he did. His job was to bring drinks to the king and to make sure they weren't poisoned. And in fact, at times, the cupbearer was always called, or not always, often called, to take a drink from the cup. And if he died, then the king obviously would not drink that. Does that make sense? So it's a really important job. And of course, it ended up being a job for many of them that was sort of an intimate relationship, a close relationship with the king and the cupbearer, because the king wants to really feel confident that the cupbearer is not going to kill him. And so this is an important relationship. Now, we do see some interesting things in this that I think history will give us a hint at, and that is, it looks like, and it's possible it's not reality, but it looks like from history that King Artaxerxes was the stepson of Esther. And then when you begin to piece things together, it looks like it's really possible that Esther, who we see running throughout the book of Esther, of course, and is mentioned in different places. The same one that we see in chapter 1, verse 1, where they're talking about the city of Susa, the citadel of Susa. This is where Esther had been and was forced into a beauty pageant, some of those kinds of things. And it looks like Esther really might be the stepmom and maybe even the mom of Artaxerxes. And so we even see in chapter 2 of Nehemiah that the queen sitting next to the king, there are some historians that think that might have actually been Esther that is there, which would make sense because Esther, of course, is there to try to save the Jews. This is another story for another day, and she's going to get maybe another opportunity to influence the stepson Artaxerxes in order to help Nehemiah accomplish the task at hand. And so Nehemiah then finds out that the walls of Jerusalem have been totally torn down and burned, and he weeps over it. Now, of course, he's been exiled a long time at this point, but he is sad. He is hurt and broken over his homeland that has been destroyed. And so he has a very interesting and death-defying interaction with the king. But both Nehemiah and Ezra, which is another book there next to Nehemiah, both of these characters take it upon themselves to go out and take leadership responsibilities to rebuild the temple and the walls. And they, of course, deal with all kinds of difficulty that would be easy to find yourself in a discouraging place. Like Ezra sets out to rebuild the temple, but he has his enemies from the north. They're coming to try and mess things up and blow things up because, of course, the people that aren't the Jews, they hate the Jews. They don't want them to succeed. They don't want their nation to succeed. And so he deals with all of that. Nehemiah, similar. He wants to come a few years after Ezra and build the wall around Jerusalem. But, of course, he has all sorts of discouragements along the way. But the good news is he also overcomes. And so we're going to get to see that. So I'm going to take you to the book of Nehemiah. Chapter 4 in particular is where we're going to spend a little bit of time. But if you don't know where Nehemiah is, if you open your Bible right to the middle, you're probably in or around Psalms, okay? So right in the middle, maybe to the little bit to the left, you'll find Psalms. And if you go backwards just a little bit, you will find Nehemiah about 3 books away. And so if you want to look that up, that would be excellent. And so as you look for that, let me give you a little bit of context then before we get to chapter 4, because I think it's important. So in chapter 1, here's what I want you to see. In chapter 1, just the first 11 verses, I may not read all of it, but listen to how it starts out. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev. This is around November, December in the Gregorian calendar. In the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came, and certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And what you see in those first 11 verses then is Nehemiah is praying over and over and over. And by the time we get to chapter 2, when something begins to change, Nehemiah would have been praying for 4 months. 4 months. It's a long time to be consistently praying, but he is praying and praying and praying, and he's praying that he has an opportunity to fix these walls. And what we find about Nehemiah is he's a risk taker, he's wise, and he was not afraid to act. He was not afraid to act when an opening presented itself. And so as we continue to look through there, we find that he has favor with the king. And in fact, one of the interesting parts about this is in chapter 2, we get down to verse 4 or so. And in chapter 2, he is bringing wine to the king, and he's a little sad. Now, if you're the cupbearer, you don't act sad in front of the king, because the king doesn't want you to discourage him, so he's just going to kill you. So you don't act sad in front of the king if you're the cupbearer, because discouragement is contagious, and if you're going to be discouraged around me, you're going to die. So that's the king, okay? I wasn't speaking for Spencer Dunlap. I was speaking for King Artaxerxes, okay? And so he brings wine. The king said to me, verse 4, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Now, here's what I love. So he's got the sad face. The king says, what's going on? And Nehemiah says, so I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to Judah to accomplish this task. What I love about it, it continues to show us the theme of Nehemiah as a prayerful guy. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen where someone confronts you and you need an answer like that. And so the king says, Nehemiah, what's the deal? So I prayed to God, and then I spoke. Probably not a big, long, detailed prayer. Oh, Father in heaven, now it is the moment that I have prayed for. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to not die, but to answer the king. No, probably Nehemiah went, oh, God, help me, and then started to speak. This is the way that it sounds, and I don't know about you, but I find myself in that position often. And so in chapter 3, then, they begin to work on the wall. And we're not going to read that, but they begin to work on the wall. He has a team of people that have come together. We see that in verses 17 and 18 in chapter 2. But in chapter 3, they begin working on the wall. They're rebuilding it, and things are going well. They're excited. They're making progress. And we find in chapter 4, verse 6, that they're halfway done with the walls around Jerusalem. This is a lot of work. They're halfway there. But there's about to be trouble. And you know as well as I do, where God is at work rebuilding and restoring and renewing things, the enemy is often lurking in the shadows to try and disrupt it, to try and break it, to try and spoil that which God is doing in His people. In fact, from personal experience and from biblical examples, when God's people are working in unity and taking ground for the kingdom, taking kingdom priorities seriously, Satan always seems to stir up agitators who will come along and try to mess things up with discouragement. Agitators who will come and say to you, it's not going to work, you're not going to win, you're going to die, it's not going to happen, to try and get progress to stop. Because Satan doesn't want Christians to take ground for the kingdom. And guess what? No one is immune to discouragement. And discouragement doesn't just come once. It seems like it's recurring, and it comes over and over. And discouragement, as I said before, is highly contagious. If you are surrounded by a bunch of discouraged people, watch out, because discouragement's on its way. And so in chapter 4, things get really complicated and really discouraging for Nehemiah and the wall builders. And so, as suspected, there are external things and internal things that are threatening to discourage them. And so we see the first two external ones. Here's the number one. The first is ridicule. In verses 1 and 2, it says this: Now, when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall. By the way, Sanballat was like a regional governor, okay? Wouldn't have loved the Jews. In fact, as the Jews are coming into the promised land, his people were one of the people that would have been pushed aside and kicked out of the area. So he is not going to be a fan of the Jews, okay? And so when he heard that they were building the wall, he was angry, greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" He's furious. And he has 5 discouraging things that he wants to say. And by the way, these discouraging, ridiculing things are common. But you know what? I think ridicule is the language of the devil himself. Ridicule. And we see it in other stories throughout the Bible, like in this story of David and Goliath. What does Goliath do to David? He ridicules him. Do you come at me with a stick and some rocks? You're just a kid. It's ridicule. We see it in Luke chapter 22 and 23, where the soldiers are mocking Jesus. It's ridicule. It's the language of the devil. And so Sanballat then, just in verse 2, we see he's doing 5 things to try and discourage them. He calls them feeble and pathetic. Have you ever been told you're pathetic? That hurts, and that's discouraging. He calls them pathetic. He questions their ability to restore the walls to what they once were. He laughs at their desire to go to the temple and have sacrifices to the Lord. He assumes they won't finish up and tries to make them believe they will never finish, and he mocks their ability to fix an old, broken down, burnt wall. But let me tell you, if there's anyone that can bring old stones back to life, it is our God. And that's what we see. And then in verse 3, Tobiah, another one of these regional governors, he jumps in with some sarcasm. In verse 3 says, Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes in on it, it'll break down the wall. If a fox even touches the wall, it's going to fall apart." Ridicule and sarcasm. And guess what? Whenever you attempt to get involved in the work of God, you will almost always experience ridicule and sarcasm. The second external factor that these guys are dealing with is one of a threat of attack and confusion. Verses 7 and 8 says, "But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that they were repairing the walls of Jerusalem and that it was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed," in other words, the big holes in the wall around Jerusalem, they were coming together, they were being closed in. What happens? They're angry. They do not want this to happen. They do not want Jerusalem to succeed, and they all plot together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. To cause confusion. You know, that's usually what happens. If someone can't break you down with their words, they'll use other things to come after you. They'll take it further. This is the mantra of the bully. This is what they stand for. If I can't beat you with my words, I can beat you with my fists. And this is what they're threatening, and from every direction. While he gives all of these different examples, Arabs, Ammonites, Ashdodites, they're surrounded. The people are surrounded. And think about these workers on the wall. They're surrounded. They must have lived in constant fear, because that's how people are. But in constant fear of being ambushed. And I suspect that would be a normal feeling. And then there were three internal pressures. Three internal things for the wall builders that we can see. And by the way, when external pressures are really immense and really intense, sometimes we begin to defeat ourselves with our own negative self-talk in our head. And that we end up becoming our worst enemy. And we end up discouraging ourselves because we internalize the voice of the enemy. And we give him a voice inside of our minds. Verse 10, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. Their resolve is failing. The resolution they had to accomplish the task is failing. And so the first internal discouragement is fatigue. It's fatigue. It's exhaustion. They are worn and weary and tired. And what happens when you're tired? You often become discouraged. The excitement and newness of the project was surely worn off by this point, and they're halfway there, but you know how a pessimist goes. We're halfway. We're only halfway. We're only halfway there. We've got so much more to do. We'll never be able to do it. They're about to throw in the towel. Why? Because they began believing the lies. They began to believe the lies and internalized it as what they already believed. In verse 10 it says, we will not be able to rebuild it. We won't be able to rebuild the wall. And this happens to us sometimes because of fatigue. If we're not being purposeful about letting God pour into us, it's easy to become tired doing the Lord's work. The second internal cause of discouragement is frustration. In verse 10, they go, there's too much rubble. There's too much junk around here. What's happening? They take their eyes off of the work. They take their eyes off of the wall. They take their eyes off of a God-commissioned project, and they focus on the waste. They focus on the destruction, not on what's happening. And by the way, I think this is also normal. I think it's similar to what we experienced with Peter. You know, where Peter gets called out of the boat, and he gets out of the boat and walks on the water with Jesus. Peter was fine as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, but when he began to focus on the storm and took his eyes off Jesus, what happened? He sunk. That's what's happening here. They've taken their eyes off of God. They've taken their eyes off of what they are to accomplish, and they've begun to focus on the destruction. And now they think they're going to fail, and they're frustrated and discouraged. And the third internal cause of the discouragement is fear. Verses 11 and 12, and our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. Their own people now are saying, get out while you still can. And fear allows us to be deceived, doesn't it? Fear allows us to doubt, and all those things together create discouragement. But this was God's work, and God's plan would not be foiled by the enemy's attack. And in fact, the enemies never do attack. In verse 15, it says God kept them from doing what they'd planned. You know, in the book Scared to Life by Doug Rumford, he talks about how we should not let fear rule in our lives. He says 60% of our fears are unfounded, 20% already are behind us, 10% are so small they make no difference, 5% are real but you can't do anything about them, and 5% are real and you can. That it's such a small thing, but it's a real thing that causes discouragement. But ridicule, confusion, fatigue, frustration, fear, all of these things, especially when they're together, discourage us from the work that God has called us to. And then, by the way, it's not only those things. We can be discouraged by all sorts of things. So what, though? Why is this important? Well, first of all, Nehemiah's model prayer that we see all throughout chapter 1 and on, to seek God's help, because it's what he's always praying for when we face unusual challenges in doing God's work, is a pattern for us. to always be in prayer constantly, even if they're little breath prayers. God, help me now, or detailed ones where we're begging God to do the things that He needs us to do, that He'll show us the way. And by the way, please don't wait until you are discouraged to pray. Pray ahead of time, and maybe you won't be discouraged. Number two, when we're praying and asking God for help, we can expect that God will use us. He will use our talents and our abilities to be part of the answer at times. What God expects you to do, He will equip you for. But what He equips you for, He calls you to it. But God does use us and our skills and abilities at times to accomplish the tasks at hand, just like Nehemiah and the wall builders. Number three, God does not always do the work for us. Sometimes He asks us to do the hard thing. 2 Chronicles 15:7 says, "But as for you, be strong, don't be discouraged, for your work has a reward." God expects us to work. God expects us to do something, not sit around and go, well, if you don't do it, I'm just going to sit here on this rock. No, He calls us to action. Number four, like-minded people. That means in unity. People together can be an enormous encouragement, but disunity will cause discouragement. Number five thing that we see from this story is that a healthy community is a serving community. Let me say it again. A healthy community is a serving community. Here at the end of the month, we have a big serve. It's in your bulletin. If you don't participate, and a lot of you won't, if you don't, you're shortchanging yourself, because it is what God has always called the church to. Faith without works is dead, James 2. But He calls the church to action. Yes, to prayer, but also to action. And if you say, that's someone else's job, you are shortchanging yourself on relationship, on unity, and the ability to be encouraged as you see the work of God flourish. Don't shortchange yourself. Number six, taking measures to keep from growing weary and doing good is necessary. It's easy to get weary, and again, we have to put ourselves in a place where God can pour into us, because if we don't allow God to pour into us, and He wants to, but if we put the cap on and don't let Him pour into us, we run the risk of running dry, and we are working out of our flesh in a place of dryness, not overflow. Number seven, focusing on the bad will always keep our focus off of Jesus. Number eight, most of our fears are simply false evidence appearing real. Number nine, Nehemiah's wall was completed in record time. Why? Well, we'll see here in a moment. But chapter 6, verse 15, and number 10, you can overcome discouragement, my friends. But how? Now what? What do we do with it? Well, the disease of discouragement is curable. And I want to show you very quickly the ABCDs of overcoming discouragement from Nehemiah. A, ask God for help. If you want practical tools, I'm going to give them to you. Ask God for help. Nehemiah does this over and over and over and over again. Ask God for help. And like in verse 9, he says, but we prayed to our God. We prayed together, and Nehemiah prayed by himself, and Nehemiah is continually and constantly petitioning God. B, be productive. That means keep going. Keep going. Don't give up, even when you're discouraged. If you're doing the work of the Lord and you know it, don't stop. Keep working. Even though there are days or hours or minutes or weeks or months you may feel discouraged, keep going. Be productive. Verse 14 of chapter 4 says, don't be afraid. Fight. That means don't be afraid and sit there and let them do whatever they want to you. No, get up and fight. Don't pull back, because when we're discouraged, that's often what we do. When we're discouraged, we shrink back and we hide, or we jump into destructive behaviors. Instead, keep productive. Keep doing what you know God has called you to, even when setbacks occur. And they went back to work. Verses 15, 16. Our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan. And we all returned to the wall, each to his work. And from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, half held the spears, shields, bows, coats of mail, and the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah. What is going on? They continued to move forward into God's mission. They pressed in because they had a common vision and a common mission, and they knew what had to be accomplished for God's glory. Proverbs 29:18 says, where there's no vision, the people will perish. Friends, we have a common vision. The C of ABCD is community is essential. Ecclesiastes 4:12, you've heard it in weddings, but here it is. And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not easily broken. Community is essential because it allows us, hopefully like-minded, common vision, mission, to rally together, to work together. So when one is discouraged, the other can pick him up. That's what Ecclesiastes says. This is what happens with Israel. Look at verses 19 and 20. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Come together and rally together. Our God will fight for us, is what it says. Stay together when we get attacked. And remember, discouragement is contagious, but so is encouragement. To encourage one another, to be a part of a tribe, a group of people who will love you and you will love, and you will rally together. It will fight discouragement. And D, depend on God for action and wisdom. Sometimes we do need to stop and reprioritize and reorganize with prayer, but then go into action. Let God guide our path, to show us the way, and to open our eyes to see vulnerable places in the wall, which is what happens to Israel. To see the vulnerable spots, verse 9 says, and we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. Verse 14, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. Sounds like Braveheart. Guess what? This is where that stuff comes from. It's from God himself. From Nehemiah to say to the people, yes, remember the Lord. Yes, pray. He is awesome. He is amazing. And now fight for your brothers. Fight for your sons. Fight for your daughters. Fight for your wives. Fight for your homes. Fight for your church. Fight for your community. So what are the vulnerable spots in your life? What are the vulnerable spots in your marriage, in your friendships, in your finances? It is time to be aware and to pray and to change things up, to put them in alignment with who God calls us to be, and to remember who God is. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Isaiah 41:10, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. My friends, God is in the business of rebuilding and restoring and renewing what is broken, what is discouraging, what hurts. And he calls us to seek him and allow him to do what he does best. To rebuild, restore, and renew, and give us a new path, a new life, a life of encouragement and strength and hope and joy and love. Because we know how this story ends. And because of that, we can have hope today. And we can rebuild the broken walls and bring glory and honor to our God. Today, you're invited to a time of allowing God to rebuild and restore and renew you. To rebuild, restore, and renew your marriage. To rebuild and restore and renew anything that is broken. As you go to the communion tables, remember the body broken and blood shed, because it is the sacrifice of the cross that gives us the ability to have a new start today. Because Christ has paid the price for you and for me. And where the Son has set you free, you are free. You are free. Let's pray. God, thank you for giving us a story that brings us to a place, hopefully, of encouragement. And so I pray today that you will take the things in our lives that are discouraging and that you will heal them. That you will rebuild, restore, and renew that which is broken. And as we take the bread and take the cup, help our eyes to see truth and to see where Christ is working and has been working in our lives and where He wants to work in our lives. Help us to cooperate and not shrink back from the fight, but to rally together, to encourage one another, and to ultimately find our strength in You. Open our eyes that we may see Your glory. We praise You for it in Jesus' name.